So, I am fascinated by the subject that we're going to get into today. So, all about the female athlete, but perhaps broaden that topic out even further still. So, we're going to need to do a bit of a check as to what's in scope for that, given the potentially the tone of the subject. But before we do that, can you just tell us a little bit about your kind of background, where you grew up, some early influences, and kind of what you got you into sport?
Wow, okay. My background most recently is as an academic and then in my current role. But previous to that, I studied sports science at university for a long time. I did my undergraduate at Exeter and I did my postgraduate in Cardiff and I did my PhD at Brunel. The reason I went to Cardiff Ewick, it was at the time, to do my masters was because I was a rugby player and I knew they were the best rugby team. And although I hadn't been playing rugby an awfully long time, I only started when I started university. I loved it, and so rather than choosing, the best place academically, I mean, it was great, but I wanted to go for the rugby, and I had a blast. I had 2 years of just being part of an amazing team, and we actually won what was then the Booster. I don't think it's called Booster anymore, but the
Bucks.
Booster
Yeah.
finals at Twickenham. And I think we were one of the last women's teams to play that Booster finals at Twickenham. I don't think they play them in there anymore. So it was that was amazing. Um, I have always loved sport. I played a lot of sport at school. I wasn't particularly very good at it, I don't think, for a long time. I remember when I was in the early years of senior school, kind of being the person who loved sport but just wasn't quite good enough to get in the team. And I remember my PE teacher was a ex-England netball player, and I've been sent in on an errand to get the bibs or something for netball because I was, the reserve of the reserve, and she just said to me, you know what, I was a reserve once. Just keep going, keep trying. And I always remember that. It was a fleeting moment in the office where she was handing me the bibs and I was taking them out to the people who could actually play netball, but it kind of stuck with me. And I think that's actually what I did in school. I just loved sport, and through loving it, I became, reasonable at some of it. And very much inspired by my family. We were a very, sporty family. My dad was always doing sport, whether it was playing cricket in the village, team, or riding the London to Brighton, or just part of our life really. And fundamentally for me, I was very wholeheartedly supported in any endeavour I undertook, whether that was sport or anything else. Actually, I was hugely supported by my family. Never said, are you sure? I don't think you could do that, or wholeheartedly supported. And I think that I've carried that feeling of wholehearted support through my life, and it sometimes makes believe I can do anything, but I think that's probably a fairly good outlook to have.
So, did you stop being the reserve of the netball team?
I did eventually, yeah. I don't think I was the strongest link in the chain, but I did. I played netball and hockey for school, and played team games actually all through till I finished playing rugby. I finished at Ewick, having been at Twickenham, and came home. And we live in the south and near London, and there was a few London women's rugby clubs at the time that were very good. Given that this was at the start probably of the women's game. And I went to some trials with people in those teams, and they were immense athletes. And, like scrawny me, who had enjoyed it, but perhaps hadn't necessarily had the physical conditioning behind the players of those clubs. I kind of looked at it and looked at how painful it might be, and went, I'm gonna bow out on my Twickenham final, and with my lovely memories and with my body still intact, and swiftly took up endurance sport, and have ever since had a love of running. And I did a marathon probably the first first spring after I left uni, so went from team sports to endurance quite quickly, and that was it for me. That's it. Running is it's like my church. It's a place I go now, less for probably the accolade of going to a race and getting my medal and getting a PB, more just to find space and connection with my own thoughts, of silence sometimes, or just that kind of being within nature. And so running for me has been a huge part of my life. off the back of a childhood of playing sort of game sports. Now I can't imagine ever not running, whether it's a shuffle or a walk eventually.
So you mentioned your dad there as an influence in terms of support and feeling really supported, and obviously that's going to be a big theme connecting with the supporting champions kind of topics of feeling supported. What was that early influence like for you? To just tell us a little bit more about some of those moments where perhaps you weren't sure, but you felt propelled because of that social connection.
I've recently thought quite a lot about this actually, because through over the last few years, probably since I've had kids actually, and been a working mum, and then exploring more recently our campaign around the female athlete, I've thought about what it is to be a woman, and I'm very passionate about giving women a voice and equality, and really connecting with lack of diversity and lack of equality. And I wondered why I'd come late to that movement. And I reflect that it's because I had such support growing up, through my family and through my school. I went to a wonderful school. It was a girls' school, but it was a wonderful school. No one ever told me I couldn't do it. And honestly, I would just assume that's how everyone lived life. And if I wanted to pursue a small or a big goal, I did. And I just didn't think twice about it, because everyone was behind me saying, yeah, go for it. Give it a try. Go for it. And so when people said, oh, I've been held back, or I've always felt like there's a ceiling for me as a woman, for a while I was like, wow, that's just never how I viewed the world. And I wondered why. And I've thought a lot about how it was how I was, supported through, whether it was sporting, whether it's academic, whether it was just life experiences, just a very go for it. Why not? You can do it. My dad gave me a poster when I was a bit younger that had two birds flying, and the words, they can because they think they can. And that was really his motto. Now my one of my favourite quotes is, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're right.
This is your Twitter bio,
it is, yeah,
isn't it? That's all you need to know about Emma Ross.
Yeah. So I think that kind of unwavering support, it does build a confidence in someone, and it builds a resilience to the naysayers, because you almost don't hear them. If you've got a loud enough team behind you cheering you on, that can give you some resilience to the people who don't think it's possible, and you kind of just go, well, who are you? All of these people over here say I can do it, so, don't worry. I remember once you said to me something like, oh, not sure many people have done that before. And I said, well, now you said that to me. Like, it's,
That's like fuel on your fire.
Yeah, because I think that's how I've, been brought up and how I live my life.
Be careful what you say to
don't
you.
say that to me anymore.
So in some ways it sounds like you're recognising the benefit that you've had from that support and that can-do attitude. You're now recognising that's quite rare, and it's not prevalent for a lot of people. And so in some ways you're acting as that cheerleader and supporter for people, for women, for a particular cause around the female athlete.
Yeah, it's always been something that I've gained enormous fulfillment from, is lifting people up and supporting them. From when I was an academic, and I recognised things in students that I wanted to help them recognise in themselves, through to things I'm doing in my role today, whether that's developing and supporting people, or campaigns to kind of really raise awareness and support of a cohort. It gives me so much satisfaction to raise others up, and maybe that's because I've felt the positive effect of it happening to me. But yeah, that's definitely instilled in my values, is putting other people up on their pedestal and saying, you're brilliant, you look at what you've done, look what you could do, rather than often getting bogged down in, but this went wrong or didn't quite go right. I'm quite a positive person, so I like to help people see that in themselves too.
Now I remember when this is going to go back a few years now. I'm not quite sure what year it was. It might have been 2011 maybe, when we we were on our bases committee. Remember being the divisional
do.
rep for sports performance?
I do remember that.
And I remember getting in a room with you, with Karen Williams, a few others, and we were talking about, what should we do, and so on. And you was just like, no, it just needs to be brilliant. Everything needs to be brilliant. And I remember we did a few exercises, and one of the things that you mentioned, that you, correct me if I'm wrong, I seem to remember, I think it was you, that you were part of a debating team at school. And I thought, that's interesting. And I can see that now. I can see that you communicate, that you heartily debate things, and encourage people to be debating as a thing.
You are correct. That's good memory, because that was a long time ago.
Ago. It stood out though, just thinking that's unusual, but I can now see the utility of that.
Yeah, actually, I went back to my old school, and it was on they have a Founders Day where they kind of celebrate the origins of the school, and asked me to give some advice to the girls, and I said, that is one of my top pieces of advice. Get out and speak out loud, because again, it was something that I did. It was part of the school, and I enjoyed it. So you do things that you enjoy at school, don't you? And we used to travel as a little team of 3, and there used to be the speaker who would prepare their talk, the introducer, and then the vote of thankser. That was the technical term. And the vote of thanks people would actually not represent their team. They would go and sit and give someone else thanks for their talk, so they'd have to think on their feet and be listening and then write some notes. And I kind of worked my way through all of those roles, and it used to be run by the Rotary Club, and we used to go to other schools and do this talking, and I loved it, and it was fun. And when I went to teach in university, and I saw students paralysed as they stood up to give a presentation, to their second year class, and their voices were shaking, and they were physically, really struggling to get through that. Again, I was like, wow, that's something that I've had a lot of practice of very early on. And I really now look back and appreciate it, because I think, the key sometimes to getting your message across, or to being heard, or to really influencing people, is to be a confident communicator. And like you say, to be able to debate things without being aggressive or making other people defensive. And the earlier you can learn those skills, the better. And by practicing them when I was 12, 13, 14, 15, I mean, I guess I just took it for granted that was something that everyone did. And then when I came to having to do it in grown-up life, I'm really appreciating the sort of grounding I'd had in that.
That is the time practicing that I recognise, of rather than thinking, I need to go and do a presentation course or a communications course to upgrade a craft skill that I'm finding that's holding me back a little bit. The time being able to do that from early doors and instilling that, and then refining that with some technical knowledge, as opposed to just adding it afterwards, seems so important. My version of that was at secondary school, was reading people. I look back at my education and think, it wasn't great. It was a rough school, but I read people.
Yeah.
You had debating team.
Yeah.
I was avoiding getting punched.
Can I be friends with you or not?
Yeah. Fantastic. So that's really interesting in itself. And I remember that discussion, but also how valuable that was in you inspiring us as a particular committee at the time to take action and to go for it. And that was amazing. So, and then you kind of branched into sticking magnets on people's heads whilst they're tired and probably upset.
And grumpy, yeah.
And even more upset.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that area of TMS.
Yeah, so I do have to dig in deep into my my neurological reserves.
Okay, so that's interesting. So it's been a while since the research.
Yeah. I think as you,
what have you left behind in your memory?
Gosh, what did I zap out of my brain, and what did I leave there? So for my PhD, I got introduced to a technique of measuring kind of the connections. For me, it was to measure the connections between the motor centers of your brain and the muscles. So by using this big magnetic coil placed over someone's motor cortex, you discharge the magnet, a rapidly changing current within the magnet itself, creates an electrical current that simulates any excitable materials around it. And if you hold it over your brain, your brain's very excitable. So it sets about an action potential. That's like a neural signal from your brain. And depending on where you're holding this magnetic coil over someone's motor cortex will decide where that signal is sent, because different parts of your brain connect to different parts of your body, essentially. And so my PhD was actually not around fatigue. It was about almost the opposite, like how muscles warm up, and does that signal get stronger? That neural signal gets stronger as you warm muscles up. So kind of a neurological warm up. And then the technique itself became very useful after my PhD and in my research for examining, okay, so what happens when we get tired? And it was at the time where there was a school of thought that, that muscle fatigue was very much metabolic, and what determined how tired a muscle got was quite local to the muscle. And then there was another school of thought that actually the brain was very much in control of the muscle itself. And so I just used this magnet and its connections to muscles to explore what that connection looked like after different types of activity, and things like very long endurance activity like marathons, through to quite discrete kind of sustained contractions of a muscle, just to explore the mechanisms of fatigue really, and see how local and how central they might be in exercise. And I think one of the things that struck me about my work in that area was when I came to that technique, it was very much used in a lab setting for thumb adduction and abduction, because the
clasping, effectively.
Essentially, or something. If you, because the hand is very well represented on the motor cortex of the brain, so it's really easy to find, and it's well controllable. And I kind of read those papers and thought, this is very interesting, but I'm not sure how, there's no Olympic event that's
useful. Well, we're rock climbing now, but
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And so I thought we need to do the leg. People use their legs a lot. And the leg was quite hard, actually, because the leg was less represented, because we don't have to have fine control of our leg. It's kind of on or off, our quads are on or off, and they're not having to do dexterous movement. So I had to go through a process of just sort of refining that technique using the leg.
So big magnet on the scalp. So as you're training to do that technique, trying to find the leg.
Yeah.
Are you getting sort of someone punching out to the right, or maybe losing some control of bodily functions?
It is a momentary loss of volitional control, and some people really dislike it, and it causes sometimes quite a physiological response. But
physiological response be give us an extreme example.
Some people couldn't tolerate it, so they went, very white.
Okay.
I'm assuming they had loss of blood, sustaining good blood pressure, and didn't feel well. And actually, the mechanical kind of events that were happening shouldn't make that happen, but perhaps the sensation or the loss of control. But generally, it's well tolerated, and and so I moved into trying to find the leg. And then I moved into going, well, it's all very well in the lab doing knee extensions where you're, pressing your leg out and in, and measuring fatigue. And that's very well controlled. And for some people, that's where their research stays, because it's really, it becomes, you can really interrogate that system. But, my brain was like, oh, let's get out. And so the first time I took the magnet out, so to speak, was following a group of cyclists who did the Tour de France route to time and schedule. They were a group of army personnel, and they had set themselves a challenge to do the Tour de France, and took a group of researchers with them. And so I packed it up in the back of my car and followed them around the Alps, and got it out at some ski lodges along the way, and did some experimentation there, which was really amazing, because it was a model of kind of huge volume of work in 3 weeks that you would never be able to replicate in the lab. And then I took it up the mountain. I took it to a lab near Everest Base Camp on the side of a yak, because we wanted to explore what chronic hypoxia did to kind of the brain's control of muscle. So yeah, from beginning with thumb adduction, I got to take it to Everest.
So do you get informed consent before they were up at base camp and have altitude sickness and impaired judgment. Because I'd imagine that's quite an easy sell. Someone's up there, yeah, whatever,
Just do
do whatever. But at the top of a mountain climb in Tour de France, probably not.
Yeah, so the good thing about working with the army is that they are very agreeable
True.
to what you want to try and achieve. They were brilliant. When we went to the mountain, we had to get some baseline before we went. So I was working with a group of academics out of the University of Otago in New Zealand. So we did our baseline there. And I think when we did it, I mean, it's not painful, but it's not the most pleasant sensation to have zaps put through your brain repeatedly for a while. So I think they were sitting in the lab in New Zealand going, oh, how is this going to feel when I'm at the top of a mountain with mountain sickness? And when I we'll probably talk about it in a minute, but when I moved over to sport and to working with, what I would call the real world of sport, I took a lot of lessons from actually even just that trip, because that was the closest thing I probably had to undergoing some of the stresses that our practitioners might have when they are off on camps, trying to make the best of what can be a tricky situation, whether equipment breaks. I remember the big magnet, the thing that I was there to use, came up off the yak and was broken. And there I was also feeling pretty rough because we'd just crossed 5,000 meters, and that does weird things to you. Trying to solve a problem with a splitting headache, feeling sick, and a magnet that, the funding that I'd been given to go up this mountain was to use the magnet. So even though I came into sport thinking, well, haven't done a traditional entry route into this job, I did look back and see very transferable skills from those type of research expeditions.
So if anyone's tuning in going, oh, neuromuscular fatigue, give me a nugget of where are we at the moment, or some advice about what can be interpreted, what would you say to them?
Oh, you put me on the spot there, Steve.
Yeah, I know.
I don't know what's current, by the way. I think, from my very biased opinion, I would say if you're out there wanting to investigate neuromuscular fatigue, do some studies on females.
You can see where this is going.
Yeah. It's like my manifesto. But I think one of the things that I really look back at my research, which looked at fatigue and described fatigue, is the so what. And the next step for me is to really understand, so what do you do about it? Because I could very clearly describe what was happening after a marathon, after an intense bout of exercise, up a mountain, on the Tour de France. I could very much describe what was happening. What I would look back now and say is, so what do I do about it? And to use those techniques in a way that allows you to understand how effective interventions might be. Because I think a lot of that research stops a bit short of actually the so what can I do if I'm that tired.
Okay. Oh, so that's a little bit like when I was fishing around for research for heptathlon. So I put heptathlon physiology or heptathlon science into the major academic journal search engines, and nothing came out, literally no results found. And then I did that a few years ago, and there are 2 studies now that were commissioned, I think, by the IAAF. But it says that they're tired at the end of heptathlon. Thanks, science. That's really helpful. We could have done with it a little bit more. But, okay. All right, fascinating stuff. So you hinted at there. So I gave you a call. So for people who don't know, I was Emma's boss 3 or 4 years or so, from 2013, 2016 or so. And the reason that I've got you on here today is to actually take a chance to look back and see some amazing successes that you've achieved in the English Institute of Sport. So you're still the head of physiology there, but so I give you a call around 2013 saying, would you consider it? And you're daft enough to take me up on that challenge. Talk to me a little bit about that transition from academia into applied sport. That's not a usual route to take.
That was an incredible change for me. So we'd probably worked together a little bit before that as academic, and then you were kind of informing me on what the questions were coming from you guys. So from that brief exchange, I thought, wow, I pretty much know know what's going on over there in the EIS.
Oh, that was enough, was it? Oh,
enough.
right. Yeah, okay. I feel supported.
And then when we did have that conversation about the job, and I've referred to it, I thought, well, it feels like a big change and a big step for me, but I have to point out that you, in terms of supporting people, you were very supportive of that decision, because I thought, if Steve thinks I can do it, I trust him. And I think it's really important to have those people in your corner. Not saying, come over here and we'll just see if you make it or you sink. Come over here because I think you can do it. And so whatever doubts I had about myself, I thought, I trust Steve.
There's a deluded bloke over there that reckons I'm in it too. Okay.
So that helped the change. And I just think when I got into the role, it was a different world than I had lived in academia, and then I had anticipated. And there was a couple of things that really, were the most immediate challenge. One was trying to understand it. So I kind of understood the physiology, and I did know what applied physiologists did. The high performance system is a very complex political landscape, and just how it all works and how how we support high performance in this country was something to figure out in itself. So that was something to get my head round. And also to come into an environment full of amazing, bright, driven, engaged people and go, hi, I'm here and I'm going to lead this team, but I didn't come from here. And I don't actually know what your life looks like on the ground. That felt very strange for me. And, people talk about imposter syndrome, but I very much felt a bit like an alien for a long time. When we used to talk about it and you said, how's that going? And I'm like, no, I'm still there. Huge testament to the people around me who I was working with were very tolerant. I think I spoke to some of them, a little bit further down the line and said, I know it wasn't normal for a leader of a team to get that involved in the day-to-day activities of what was happening on the ground. But I needed to do that to kind of just see how everything worked. And thank you for allowing me the space to do that without kind of going, back off, buddy. So it definitely takes a little bit of navigating in terms of things don't operate as they might operate in that team for a while, as that person finds their feet and finds their view of the world and their understanding of the world. And I remember coming home from work most days, and because people talked in a different language, and I was exhausted at just trying to understand.
Can you pinpoint what that was? What was that exhaustion? Because that's a familiar thing in terms of starting a new job, and you sort of go in and go, well, I just had my induction, I was given my computer, but I am so tired.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what that was?
Yeah, I do. I think that the terminology and the semantics and the vocabulary around a profession or around a culture, if you aren't completely tuned into that, it feels like you're learning a new language. And I support the practitioners who work in sailing, and when one of them was new into the role, I could see in him that sense of sort of exhaustion. And because sailing is a very technical sport, and the vocabulary is very technical, and I related to him completely. I said, do you think they're speaking a different language? And he said, it feels like it. And now 2 years down the line, he's fluent, and he's bouncing around the place. But it definitely was just the language. You would say, the technical leads, and my interpretation of the word technical was technical, like a technician. And that's not what it meant. Technical in our world now in the EIS, very much means the technical, the scientific component of someone's role. Or, and for me, that didn't fit with what I used that word before. So there were all of these words that were being used, and how the world operated, that took so much concentration. When I was in meetings, I kind of couldn't really focus on what people were actually saying. It was just trying to make a meaning of yeah, exactly, like what are they talking about. But I do sort of understand how people say, if you want to learn a language, you go and live in a remote French village where no one will speak to you in English. That's kind of what it felt like, as in you very quickly start spouting the same nonsense and go, yeah, then this is the language I speak now. And that helps with the imposter syndrome, but it certainly doesn't eradicate it, because I think there's much of your own making. I think I brought with me some credibility from the work that I had done. And like I said, I'd done lots of research that had taken me into the field. And so I had lots of transferable skills that I think people really recognise. And I came with a background in neurophysiology that was slightly different from perhaps some of the more traditional physiology backgrounds of the team, which were sort of more metabolic or endurance based. And I think that was really great because I could add a different dimension, a new way of thinking about things. All I could see was I didn't know enough about metabolism, or I didn't know enough about endurance sport. Actually, what the benefit was. There were already people there who could do that. I was bringing something else, and actually that benefited everybody. So the imposter syndrome was probably of my own making for a little while.
And how did you begin to come to terms with your presence there, and how did you manage that, if you have?
Yeah, if I have. Do you know what? I think there are just markers in when you're doing a role, or just when you're developing yourself, where you think that thing, that conversation, that meeting, making that decision, doing that difficult thing felt okay. Like I was in control. It didn't overwhelm me, and I managed it, and I could make some really good decisions around it. The first time you do that thing, you are treading water, and you're literally holding it going, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. I'm going to go with my instinct. I believe in myself. I'm having this very difficult conversation. I feel totally out of my depth. And as time goes by, you realise that you're talking to the same people who you found quite tricky before, but you're holding your own. You're able to express your own opinion rather than just saying, yes, okay, yes. And you become, much more robust in that environment. And that's when I think you take a step back at the end of the day and you think, 6 months ago, that would have scared the living bejesus out of me. Today I walked into that and I felt really secure in myself. I felt secure. I had the experience behind me. And that experience is having done it before. And I think one of the things that I talk about to people who I work with now and I develop and support, when they say, I feel like I'm ready to go to the next level, but what things do I need to tick off? What jobs, tasks, responsibilities do I need to do? And I say, some of this is about just riding it out and seeing what happens, because there are some things that are so unpredictable that will come up that will be the best learning experiences for you. And it's really hard to say you just got to serve more time, because that feels a bit untangible. But in that time, in that role, I know things will present themselves to those people that I can't predict. I do not know what is going to happen, but I know those unpredictable things will be the biggest learnings. And that's certainly what happened to me. I could tick all of the competencies, that I needed to do that role. I had to live those experiences to gain a sense of, self-belief, and also give me the confidence to deal with those experiences again in a more confident way. And that is time served, really, sometimes.
So there's a couple of things there in terms of that. Actually, just bolstering yourself, the self-belief, and recognising that you are who you are. You are relevant in that sense, but also being patient with. It's going to come with time in role in many ways, and exposing yourself so that. And also sounds like a little bit of management of nerves in a situation where perhaps this is new, this is novel, and that's then accumulating in my mind rather than how's this going in this conversation and what do I want to get out of it.
Yeah, for sure. That first year in the role was a massive learning curve for me. And as much as I learnt about being in the role, I also learned what I would have done differently in my previous role. And I think I would go back to see my PhD students who were still studying at the university that I'd previously worked at. And I would go back in and they'd be like, whoa, who are you? Because I'd be saying the so what bit, what do we do with this knowledge? And they were like, I was just kind of trying to find some stuff out. And I was like, no, but why?
So what?
Yeah. And I went back with a real passion, and that has only increased for translating some of the stuff that was happening back in academia into usable information for the applied world. But also, one of my biggest reflections was, I was teaching them the wrong stuff.
I remember you saying this to me, we are teaching the wrong stuff, which we're really aligned on. And, obviously part of the sort of work that we're producing is to try and correct that, because it's not changing a lot in the landscape of higher education.
I would agree, because when we see lots of really bright graduates come to us to get jobs, and it's not changing yet. They don't come with the skills they need to really, really thrive in this world of dealing with people in a high performance environment. And I think of all the times I tried to make the Krebs cycle exciting, but actually, and that's important, obviously, to have the fundamental knowledge. No doubt, that's almost taken for granted. You come out with a really good knowledge of the technical landscape. But yeah, I did not spend enough time or thought on how to incorporate. It doesn't have to be a separate event. How to incorporate this personal effectiveness essentially into all of a student's learning journey throughout their time at university or even before that. So yeah, that's something I really appreciate having moved from academia into the applied world to be able to make that reflection. I think it's something that more people should do. Step out. We work with some academics who we collaborate with, and doing so and answering very applied questions that aren't going to get into journals that will give them huge impact factors, but they are hugely impactful for performance or impactful for health and well-being of athletes. By bringing those academics into our environment and saying the constraints are this, this and this, and no, we can't control for that, that and that, but we still need to know the answer to this question. And they go, okay, let's, and we work with people who say, okay, let's do it. Yeah. But that, I think, as an academic, when you go back to teach students, you take that with you. You don't take that kind of, the world looks like this and it's very controlled, and you take back the stories for me, I think are fascinating. What coaches say, what athletes say, what happens on the top of a mountain. All of those stories help contextualize how you're going to be able to deliver this technical content. And I think you only get that by exposing yourself to those conversations or that environment.
We're definitely aligned on that one. So imposter syndrome, hurdle beyond that, and now you're starting to drive and lead a particular project around the female athlete. Now, this is very much a case of, this isn't about you saying, well, I've got some applied experience in this area, I'd like to work on it. This is a whole domain that needs the spotlight being put on it. Can you just tell us a little bit about the origins of the project and what it is, the backdrop really of it?
Yes, I mean, you're right. It's a huge area. This is not just a research project. We call it a campaign. And you're very right in that we've put a spotlight on it now, and because it needs it. And I'll talk about how hopefully that will evolve. But the approach started through two avenues, really. One was very data-driven, because in performance we often look at the data to help drive our decisions. And the data says that Tokyo will be the closest thing to parity in terms of the medals on offer for female and male athletes. So there's more opportunities for female athletes to medal at the next games in Tokyo. And when you look at all of the other top table nations in the Olympics, the split of medals distributed between their male and female athletes is usually half and half, sometimes more, actually aligned to the women, 55%. When you look at Team GB, the female athletes don't contribute that much as 50%. They're slightly lower, more 40% to our total medal tally. And so that data allowed us to say, is there anything we could do to lift these female athletes up so they can contribute, in kind of line with other nations who we're competing against? Is there anything we can do to optimise our support of female athletes that we're not already doing? So that's the data-driven side. The other side is that there are some great practitioners across our system who are already trying to work in this area, understanding the female athlete better, whether that be through medicine, physiology, nutrition, psych, and recognising that we don't do enough in this area. People don't know enough about supporting the female athlete as a female, and we often transpose our success stories from the male athlete, how we coach them, how we support them as practitioners, we just transpose that practice onto females because it's worked over here. Why should it not work over here? Without making really due considerations around this person being a female. So we had these stories coming up from the system, and we had the data. And so my kind of responsibility about 2 years ago was to say, okay, well, let's just kind of look at what we are doing. Where are the challenges? Where are the opportunities in doing a better job of supporting our female athlete? So that journey, that original journey of talking to people about female athletes and how we support them was fascinating because it varied from talking to people involved in the pathways of sport saying we have lots of females dropping out, and one of the reasons might be because there's no visible career route for them after sport. Where are the female coaches? Where are the female PDs? The natural progression for athletes is to sometimes stay in sport, but there's no women in those roles. So as a female athlete, you would be cautious. What does my life look like in 8 years' time? Well, I don't see anyone doing anything in that domain. So there was conversations like that, really interesting, very culturally based, very kind of looking at society and how we view women's sport, and then through to talking to the medics and the physiologists, saying how much opportunity there is to better understand, for example, the menstrual cycle and the hormonal fluctuation across a month that happens uniquely in women, it just doesn't happen in men. And how we could use that as an opportunity in terms of supporting female athletes, and perhaps we don't have enough knowledge of that as a system of practitioners. So those conversations really informed what we call a campaign of work that aims to, in the first instance, really raise awareness of how we could better support our female athletes. Raise awareness in coaches, in practitioners, and in the athletes themselves. One of the things we've noticed is that, as a female athlete, you might assume that they're pretty tuned into their body. They know what's optimal, but we as girls haven't had conversations about what is happening inside our body for a long time. We have them at school, and then sometimes we don't have them again. And so actually to have kind of normalized things and go, oh, this is just happening every month. That's fine. This is what I get. This is what I feel. This is what happens to me. Yes, it affects my training like this or my recovery or my performance, but this is life, right? And just to carry on, and so even the athletes themselves were really open to some raising of awareness of just the fundamentals of what it is to be a female who is an athlete. And so that's our first kind of wave of this campaign, is to really raise awareness, and through that we've learned so much because we've spoken to over 200 coaches and practitioners about this, and we've spoken to over 100 athletes about this. And we've learnt so much about what we do know and what we don't know.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Let's pause on that, because that's something that I'd like. What have you learnt, and what still lays untapped. So there's quite a lot in there. It's a multidisciplinary view on this. It's psycho-biological, sociological, cultural, medico. I'm not sure how many hyphens I've got in that word, but. So the classic case of let's only recruit 12 guys to this study. Why guys? Because we don't know when each of the girls might be on their period, for example. Let's remove that as a factor that we don't have to. It doesn't have to spoil our results, and it will make a cleaner observation for studies, which. I remember those sorts of discussions with practitioners of just thinking, well, we have no body of knowledge to draw upon, so potentially we've got to create some case studies ourselves as a potential problem. Then you're talking about this lack of vicarious role models, young athletes looking ahead and thinking, I can't see my future self in the senior athlete generation, and so I'll opt out. In many ways, it's like an absence of information, hidden discussions that just don't happen because we don't normalise it, as you say. Yeah, completely.
The biggest learning we've had, I think, is that given the safe space to talk about this stuff And it can be about menstrual cycle and periods. It can be about breast support. It can be about pelvic floor health. It can be about emotional support. Given a safe space to talk about this, coaches, practitioners and athletes are usually quite happy to do so. But it requires a lot of work to make that space.
In what way? What do you mean work? Or as in encouragement or role modelling?
Yeah, so I think society as a whole, we can't, look at sport and say it's not doing a great job. Society as a whole, we don't talk about, we take a subject like menstruation, we don't talk about it. And so it's no wonder when you go into sport that men haven't talked about it with their wives or daughters, or they don't want to talk about it with a young female athlete, and the young female athlete certainly doesn't want to talk to her middle-aged male coach about it, because they don't necessarily understand or know the value of talking about it. So it's not to talk about it for being intrusive or just being very liberal and going, yeah, we're going to talk about periods because that's what I can do that. We're in the business of performance, and there is a huge impact on performance. These hormones, for example, have a huge impact on the psychology and physiology of training, adaptation and performing. If we don't talk about it, we are doing a disservice to performance. And you wouldn't ask a nutritionist to not talk about hydration or...
Okay, so in some ways, let's talk a little bit about the effects on performance and the insights that you're gathering. But there's almost a bit of pre-work there to normalise and to say it's okay. In a similar way that one of our guests, Louise Minchin, BBC Breakfast presenter, she didn't talk about it on the podcast, but since she started to talk about her symptoms in the menopause, for example, and how that feels, there's a massive outpouring of, oh, we're allowed to talk about that now, are we? As opposed to that's a one-to-one with a doctor, for example.
I think that medicalisation of things is a problem because, even in sport, athletes might go to the sports doctor if they had a problem, but we're not always talking about a clinical problem. We sometimes are, certainly, and normalising things like a loss of period is a horrible myth that's anything but unhealthy, and that is a clinical problem that needs that just needs some work, and it's can be solved, and but outside of the clinical, there is this whole wealth of opportunity to understand physiological functioning, for example, of the female better to improve performance. And so you've mentioned sort of the lack of research. There's a few figures banded around, and the general consensus is there's just a lack of research on females. I think one study showed that, I think he took 3 of the major journals in sports performance, we're not talking about health here, performance, and 3% of the participants were females and studied for being female, not studied at a time of their cycle where they most look like males, i.e. the hormones were very low.
3%?
3%.
So that's solely female focused?
Yes, yeah, so that we can account for example, the menstrual cycle. Because,
wow.
Not only are females different physiologically, but females are different physiologically to other females at different to themselves at different times of the month. The fluctuations and level of these hormones throughout the months, the rises in estrogen, the rises in progesterone, and the falls of those hormones, as well as others, but those are the 2 ones that we often talk about, make them a different physiological being almost, make their body slightly different in terms of its ability to adapt, or if we are trying to build up the lining of our uterus to prepare to hold a baby, or to strip it away because we didn't have an egg fertilized, your body is trying to do different things, and that has to have a spillover effect on your other functions. These hormones are very powerful. So we have a lack of research understanding that. And let's also not forget that half of our female athletes are on the oral contraceptive pill. There's some nice data from Kirsty Elliott-Sale showing that. So we've also got another population of physiological specimens whose hormones are doing something different. And we don't know about this. So we have very little evidence on which to base some of the decisions we're making, but we have enough evidence to know that there is significant opportunity to understand it better, in terms of, particularly in the injury literature, there's evidence that estrogen affects joint laxity, for example, and kind of the structure of what holds our joints together, and therefore injury rates increase in the premenstrual symptom, or when estrogen is high as well. Now, a lot of people only have one severe injury in their life. The chances of them even at the time occurring to them, when did that happen? So it takes a long time and a lot of literature to actually provide the evidence. And then you say, well, what do you do with it? As a high performer, you can't say, just sit down for a couple of days, don't move because you're likely to be injured.
Not train for a few weeks.
Yes. So that that next level of if I'm a female athlete, I'm an elite athlete, I can't say, well, these premenstrual symptoms make me, want to run slower. I've got heavy legs, I've got bloatedness, I've got nausea and vomiting. So I'll probably just take a day off. Actually that doesn't sometimes, add up in the high performance environment. So it's, a case of what can we do? And I think
in terms of the fact that we're just not sensitive enough, or we don't know how to manage that piece of information yet, as another factor in a similar way to muscle soreness or bad night's sleep that can majorly affect your hormonal rhythm during the day. This one is happening over a month, for example.
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to having a space and a culture where we talk about it, because ultimately if you had a really great relationship with your coach and you said, I'm about to come on my period and I feel terrible today, very heavy legs, I'm not going to train as well in this session. Shall we think of something else? Because I'm either going to just do a crap session, or we could be creative around doing something. And then in 2 days' time, I can do that session and I can get the stimulus and the adaptation I need. To get to that point, even to that point, you have to have the relationship to have the conversation. B, as the female athlete, you need to have an awareness of where you are in your cycle. And we assume, some of the coaches will say, well, surely, all females know when they're, where they are in their cycle. No, they don't. Some people don't have regular cycles. Some people just aren't in tune with it. Lots of things can change your cycle length. It was surprising to me how many athletes didn't monitor their cycle. You can now monitor your cycle with, for example, just commercially available apps. So it requires being tuned into that. So to get to the point where you can be, I say it's about what we want people to be is intuitive. What we don't want people to be is really clumsy around the menstrual cycle, because we don't want people saying, right, okay, like I've got a squad of females, you're all in your luteal phase, like you go over here and do this training, and then you're all in your follicular phase, you go over here. That feels really clumsy because, this athlete isn't just a menstrual cycle, just like they're not cortisol or they're not another hormone, that they are this puzzle of pieces. When it becomes intuitive, when we've got enough knowledge and the culture is right, and it becomes an intuitive part of the coaching or practitioner process, where it just goes, someone can just have a quiet word and you go, okay, yeah, you're not going to do that really intense SAQ session today because you are in that zone where the injury risk is high, and you are someone whose hamstring gets tight at that point in your cycle. We have enough knowledge and intel to be able to say, I'm going to just slightly change that session for you, because it actually reduces the risk of you being injured.
So there are some general principles there to apply, and it might be worth just sharing some of those observations about premenstrual, menstrual, and so on, that might be useful for people to tune into, to understand. But equally, what you're appealing to there is an individualization, an attentiveness for the subtle symptoms that people will report, regardless of their origin in some ways. Or the fact that it links to specific female responses is sort of by the by, but here it hasn't really been discussed and considered as much as it could have been.
Yeah, I think so you referred to that there are opportunities or things to consider across the menstrual cycle that might be useful, and I think you also mentioned individualization, and that's where we have the challenge in it. And it's not a unique challenge when we're talking about supporting athletes, for example, that you can look that generally this happens after you do this session in terms of adaptation, but you are faced with an individual who just might not do that. They might be an outlier on that, bell-shaped curve. And so it is very much individualized. And I listened to a talk once, I think it was by a consultant gynecologist, he said, sometimes I can have a bottle of wine and I'm fine. And other times I have a bottle of wine and I'm on the floor. And I was like, where's he going with this? And the metaphor was that even within a single female, her menstrual cycle might affect her differently each month, like the bottle of wine affected him differently. So not only do I have different menstrual symptoms and reactions to my menstrual hormonal fluctuations than another female will, I might also have different responses across my lifespan. Certainly that's something I can speak to or experience, but also across a year, some months you might have a heavy period or your symptoms might be different. So making generic recommendations becomes very challenging, but equally we do have some knowledge, like with the injury risk, we know it's when estrogen is high. There's some research that progesterone plays a role in kind of the neural circuitry of motor control, and actually that might interfere with coordination, might leave people feeling slightly clumsy, which is really important if you're in a sport where control, fine coordination, target accuracy is important. Because actually it might just be that one day you're practicing and you're a millimetre off, like no biggie. It is for your confidence, right? And you become a less confident athlete. Like why? And actually, unless you know that, and you've seen a pattern, so knowing yourself and knowing your athlete becomes really important. So we know that premenstrual symptoms are very common. So if you're working with a female athlete, it's likely, or a female, it's likely that if she has a menstrual cycle, that is, she's not on the pill, she will have some premenstrual symptoms. And we know they are hugely wide-ranging. So it's not just the, very conventionally known, I have stomach cramps or I have a headache. Like I said, they can be nausea, they can be vomiting, sensitivity to light, heavy legs, just overwhelming fatigue, all of these things. But not normalising that to say, actually, you talking about it will allow us to try and give you strategies. Now, the nutritionist might have ways of giving you some food plans that help in those times. There might be ways to take just simple anti-inflammatory medicine. I know that certainly our doctors give a really simple way of taking, your usual ibuprofen, but really in advance of you getting symptoms that you're going to get, that becomes much more effective way of dealing with the pain than if you just think, I'm in so much pain, I'm going to take an ibuprofen now. Simple strategies, not always medically based. Often strategies like if you're a very emotional person because of your hormones at certain times of your cycle, that is going to affect not only you, it's going to affect the people around you. And we know that in team situations, that one person, and imagine all of those people having different emotional responses at different times. So how can you work with the psych to make you more robust in those times, to make you more kind of reflective of, okay, this is just me for now. This is not me forever. To not have a panic about, now I can't do my sport, or now I'm a lunatic. So the luxury of it being a multidisciplinary challenge is that it has multidisciplinary opportunities to help find strategies. Yeah, I think the really interesting thing for me is that people often look to find a solution to some of the challenges that the menstrual cycle, for example, might throw up. And often there's just an opportunity to work better aligned with, a multidisciplinary team, whether that's a psych that's allowing you to recognise how your emotions change, how you might deal with them, how you might, as a team member when you're working with someone else, deal with that. If, for example, you do have some more physical symptoms that make you feel less like an athlete. So we know body composition changes, for example, and athletes do report that, for a certain time of the month, few days, they don't feel like an athlete. They don't think they look like an athlete because actually, if they retain water or they put on a kilogram of weight, for them, that's not what they want to see. It's not it's transient, it's just part of this physiological cycle. But if you can work with a psych, for example, to help you just be a bit more robust through that period, makes you a bit more resilient to those doubts or those, I feel like a bit like a fraud today. Well, no, you're not. You're just you, and you're just going through this. It's not always a case of fixing it with a medicine or a pill. There's lots of other strategies, and they won't always solve the problem down to nothing. They will help you as a person manage it. And I think in doing that, in knowing yourself and knowing your athletes so you can provide those strategies, you also open up opportunities. And whilst the research isn't hugely compelling yet because there's not enough of it, there's certainly suggestions to say that, if you were to do a strength block at this time of your cycle, when your body is slightly more inclined to build muscle than it is to break down muscle, then that might be a more effective strength block, for example. Like I said, the evidence isn't quite compelling enough. Certainly, sometimes there's no risk in just playing around with this if it's within the scope of what you can do. Sometimes it's not. And, we're talking about very subtle opportunities. When you're working, imagine if you're working with a squad of 30 athletes, it becomes slightly harder. You have to be slightly more creative, and you might not be able to get to those nuances. But it's all about exploring this. If we step back and say, well, we're not even talking about it. We can generate all the research in the world. We can find out exactly what all these hormones do to recovery, sleep, adaptation, performance. And if you haven't got a culture where you're talking about it, it's intuitive to bring it into the coaching process, then it doesn't matter, right? The two remain completely parallel to each other and not integrated. And for me, there's just one thing about building a culture where this is something that just becomes part of the performance conversation. And I'm a massive fan of Brené Brown. Probably she's my superhero, and she speaks to me every day because I listen to her most days. So I feel, when you feel like you know someone. Oh, my mate Brené.
Let's be vulnerable. Yeah. Let's be vulnerable together.
But she actually talks a lot about shame and what drives sort of the feelings of shame or the culture of shame. And I think what she says is really applicable to driving taboos or things that have stigma around them in our culture, in our society. And that is if you have silence, secrecy and judgment. And I think if we can remove those things from talking around factors that are specific to the female athlete, again, let's just use menstruation and menstrual cycle as an example. So we have silence because we don't talk about it. We just not at large as a society talking about it. And we certainly, I don't think, have cultures in sports where we are openly talking about it enough. We have secrecy because even as females ourselves, if we are on a period and we need to use the toilet to change our sanitary products, we stuff it up our sleeve and we sneak to the loo. Like even in front of our female friends where it's completely normal to say, I'm just going to pop to the loo. And I'm taking an accessory because that's what, happens in life. So that's the secrecy bit. We need to be much better. We don't need to wave a banner or a flag, but we do just need to be better at it not being a secret. And the judgment thing, I think, is really hard because we very much like to judge people. Everyone does. I think we judge through our lived experiences. So it's very hard when someone says, I've got debilitating stomach cramps, because essentially my uterine lining is being ripped from the walls of my inside. It might be hard for a male coach who's never, he's had a tummy ache, but never experienced that, to not go, all right, get on with it.
As in the characteristics of being an elite athlete is being about robust and tough and
not being weak. Yeah. Okay. And it's not just that males don't have a lived experience of, for example, menstrual cycle symptoms, because also females will have a different experience. So if I hadn't experienced, pain that can make you vomit, I haven't. And when someone says, I was nearly sick with the pain, I go, is it possible that that's real?
Yeah, okay.
And so the judgment you put upon this person or, their story is just is that you haven't experienced it, so you can't connect with it. So for me, empathy has to be really important in this creation of this culture, that if you've got someone who's saying this, let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation. Let's not have a judgment. And, people might say, well, surely if you're an athlete and a coach and you're talking about it, this has to happen. It's performance. But through this process, we've had coaches saying, do not come in here and tell my athletes how to get off training. That's a perception, right? Because that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to find opportunities for them to train harder, be healthier. There has been a perception of, well, I've just got on with it in my life. Why? And so we are breaking down some of this judgment. And until we do that, and that goes right down to little comments that might happen in just in environments where there is groups of people call it banter. But if you are going around going, oh, a bit hormonal today, or, oh, whatever euphemism you want to say, aren't flow visiting, even those type of semantics in the environment it might not affect that person that you've had a joke with, but it can make someone else go, oh, I'm just not going to mention that. So I think those three things, silence, secrecy and judgment, are, the thing that will perpetuate us not being able to talk about anything. And I mean anything. We've talked about menstruation, but actually factors that are specific to females are things like breast support, so having the appropriate breast support. They are menstruation, managing your period as a thing, and then the menstrual cycle as a whole and the effects it has on you. Things like pelvic floor health, so stress incontinence. We think that affects lots of women who've had children, and it does. We also now have data that it affects young athletes, so they're having stress incontinence. A young, healthy, fit athlete shouldn't be involuntarily leaking urine. But we know that it's very underreported and therefore it's untreated.
Okay, another taboo, effectively.
Another taboo. And because it's quite embarrassing, right? But whilst we normalise all of this stuff, because it's being judged and because we're keeping silent about it, we cannot possibly say that we're optimising or exploring the opportunities to optimise performance for females. But also, what for me is really exciting, and this speaks to my values completely, that if we have female athletes who feel completely empowered to have conversations about whatever they need to have with their coaches, their performance team, in pursuit of optimal performance, and they can come out, in the press or whatever medium that they choose to communicate with society and talk about this stuff as part of their performance journey, women will see that and say, oh, okay, so if you do have stress incontinence, you can still go running, right? That's okay, or that's manageable, or there is ways to fix that. If you're finding it hard to manage your menstruation, manage your heavy periods, but you've got an athlete going, I get heavy periods, and this is the things I found. Suddenly, the barriers that have been causing girls to drop out of sport or women not to have a lifelong sustainable relationship with physical activity, movement and sport, suddenly those barriers start to drop because we've got role models.
So
sorry, I went off on a rant there.
Yeah,
you can see that.
Good. Yeah, it's like go
something that I'm very passionate about.
Okay, so let's try and summarise some of that, then, because it's ultimately embracing you as a unique individual first and foremost, and accepting that male or female, it's going to be a non-linear route to the top anyway, and so that you have to understand the unique characteristics of that person in that moment of time, and this is a different set of things that we need to be considerate of and conversant with. It feels as though at the very least, talking about this can prevent the cascade of a negative effect. I'm feeling a bit rough today, so let's talk about your sleep, let's talk about your nutrition, let's talk about your period, and it's part of the conversation. But it seems like there's an underpinning necessity for us all to contribute, for us all to be part of a constructive conversation, and the bare minimum feels as though that we cannot be in any way ridiculing it as part of the culture or the team ethic, that it's okay to pass a quip, which means that effectively somebody could be in a state of learned helplessness or shut down, that I'm just not going to bother talking about this, I want this to go away.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you talked about very much being the individual, male or female, and I think that is absolutely right. It just has to be part of this performance puzzle. And I think one of the things I love about applied practice in sport is that you have to be super creative, and this is one of those things that poses you as a practitioner or a coach with an opportunity to be creative, because you are presented with an individual who has their own factors that are influencing their ability to be an athlete, and you get to be creative and you get to go to multidisciplinary, connections and say, how do I solve this? And the female athlete part, just fuels that fire of, oh, this puzzle is really complicated. But for me, I think that, should be something that you might relish as a practitioner. And certainly I always say, in sport, we're always looking for, no stone unturned, right? Performance, we've just looked at everything. And when you look at the female component of female athlete, there's a whole blooming beach of stones.
Stony
yeah,
beach.
and some of them, some of these assumptions that we're making about this works in males, but it might not work in females. It might be, yeah, it does. You could turn that stone back over, it's fine. But there'll be some real nuggets, and they'll be very specific to individuals or... But for me, it's a really exciting opportunity. It should be seen as an exciting opportunity rather than seen as a weak. Like you said, athletes don't like to be seen as weak. This is not a weakness. This is a huge... It's about raising awareness and educating and empowering the system. And then it's just about realising the opportunity.
So an amazing project, and it sounds as though there's so much more to come from this. So I'm excited to see what comes from this. And also really... admirable for the system to lead this out. That's amazing. If we talk about sort of no stone unturned and thinking about beaches, I'm thinking about sort of a meteor shower around this idea of female leadership. And I know you're passionate about this and having a voice and acting as a role model. I remember, again, one of the comments that you made to me was, I don't have a role model as a female scientist looking up. Talk to us a little bit about that in the context of what we've just heard about. We've got to start talking about this. We've got to make sure that we are benefiting from this expertise and this idea of moving forward collectively.
So you're right. It's something I'm very passionate about. For me, it's as much about diversity as anything else. I don't think systems, organisations, teams can function as well as they need to if they don't have diversity. That's diversity of, people's thought, people's lived experiences, people's culture. But to have that diversity, you need women around the table. And we cannot be, whether we're talking about sport or we're talking about business, we cannot solve problems and innovate as well as we could do if we just have a group of men sitting around the table. And I'll give you a good example that leans back to the female athlete stuff, is that when Apple created their monitoring functions in the iPhone, they forgot to put in menstrual cycle. They measured you could measure or monitor everything else as a human being, and they forgot to put menstrual cycle. And you could imagine a group of men sitting around the table going, have we got everything in this phone? Yeah. And there's a great book. It's by Caroline Criado Perez, I think I'm saying her name right, called Invisible Women. And it's about how the data bias is a bias for women in general in the world, and how things have been created or how the built space has been created through to how decisions are made within big organisations. And it just comes back to that, having diversity around the table. So I'm a huge believer in seeing diversity all around us, and not just gender, but this is something that I can connect to, because I think in leadership, it's important not only for the decisions and the way that an organisation can move itself forward, but it's also, like you said, the visibility of those people for everyone else down their career paths to look up and say, okay, I see what I can be. I see I can be anything. Because you know what, probably goes back to where we started. I truly believe you can be anything you want to be. But if you can't see it, it's really hard to believe that. And I think, again, back to the women's sport piece, the visibility that women's sport is getting now, particularly this summer of sport, Women's World Cup, the women's football viewing figures have been amazing. There's young girls seeing things they've never seen before, right? They've seen women playing football on telly with 6 million people around the world watching them. that feels different. The same as it will feel different if you have more women in leadership. Those people seeing a pathway to, rather than just hitting a ceiling and going, this is probably where I'm going to end up. And you need role models to pull you up. And I'll tell you why. And this isn't everyone's path through life as a woman, but when you have a family, you go through some significant changes, physically, psychologically, and in terms of your career and how you can approach that, how you can deliver your job, but also what you want from your job. And that is something that, as much as men who become parents also go through, an immense journey when you have children, as you know, women go through a very unique journey at that time. And if you haven't got anyone coaching and mentoring you through that, it can be catastrophic for either your career, your mental health, or both. And that's one thing I really notice, is that support around women. As they're pregnant and they're all like, oh, I'm just going to come back and nail this, being a mother and being an ace worker as well. That through that time of complete ignorance, through the other end, when you come back to work, you're suddenly doing your work in a very different way. You are a very different person. You have less headspace. We actually probably more super productive, but at that time there's lots going on. And I think when I look at my journey, that was the bit where I was most vulnerable and I had some severe wobbles. And I think there's lots of people who could easily say, no, I'm not going to keep going into those leadership positions, into those director positions, because this is already really hard. I've come back and it's not sustainable. I'm just gonna stay here, or maybe back here for a while. And that's because there's no one to help. There's no one pulling you through and going,
okay, that's interesting then, in the sense that there's a strength of argument around diversity of opinions that are ultimately the opposite of that is an echo chamber of similarly like-minded middle-aged men making the same decisions. But ultimately it sounds like there's a self-perpetuating spiral that could continue there, that middle-aged man, bored, stereotypical view is designing work and an environment for people of the future, and therefore ultimately taking the step to enrich and widen that perspective is creating a positive future for the future workforce to say, I can do that too, or it's stretching that ambition. It's the same as the dropout rates in that sense. So I don't see myself in the future in the same way.
Yeah, and I think, so to explain my current situation, I took over from you when you went into a director role, and I took over as the head of physiology, and we kind of worked out what would be manageable to be able to do that role, but also I knew I wasn't going to work full time because I wanted to spend some time at home with my then young son. And so we worked out what that would look like, and so I worked that job in a less than one FTE. So that was, for me, that's a supportive approach to, like, let's try and make this work. If you're the right person and you bring the right skills and you bring the right energy and all of that, and we actually really want you, why can't it be 4 days and not 5 days? Like, who says? The rules of the working week say that's really all that says that.
The Industrial Revolution rules that we set around factories.
Yes. And then when I had my second child, and just by nature of the way the EIS works, we are spread all around the country at high performance centres, and there is some travel involved. No 2 days are the same. That was what makes the job amazing. But it also is logistically quite challenging if you're a mum having to kind of do some nursery drop-offs and pickups. And then suddenly you've got two of them to look after and you're trying to manage that. So I went back and said, I don't think this is sustainable for me. I can't be a healthy individual. And I'm talking about mental health here. I had a huge sense of overwhelm at that time. Like, I don't know how to do this, but I also don't know how to fix it because there's nothing, I can't see it. And I can't find it. Like if I just desperately do a Google search for jobs that I could do, it's probably a short list. None of them say, oh, we'd encourage flexible working or part-time. We consider job share. Like they all say, this role is big full role, and you know, it's going to be very busy. So I felt huge overwhelm, and I felt completely out of control of what to do about it. Talking in that situation really helps, because actually what we came to was a solution that this job could be shared in a job share capacity. And at first I was like, I don't think you can share a leadership role. Like, who's the lead, right? Who's the leader? And
was that in your head, or
definitely in my head? It was like, this is my job, so what bits of it would I give away if I wanted to share it? And you know that, like, no, I don't think that could happen. And ultimately it came down to, well, what can't you manage about this job? What could the job share help fix? Oh yeah, all of that stuff. Shall we actually have a think about it? So, you know, even in my own head, I was like, I don't think you can job share that role. Of course I don't think you would find a role that you, well, there are certainly, sorry, that's silly a conversation. There are lots of roles that I think aren't currently probably thought as a job share roles that you could job share. So we went out, job share. Yes, lots. We could have a whole other podcast about how to make a job share work. But I found a great partner in crime, someone who was, again, just like I had, stepping up into this leadership role. She happened to live in the other half of the country to me, which was great geographically. That happened, you know, because she was the right person, and luckily she lived up there. But it split the travel. It also split the role in half, you know, that we could share the responsibilities. We tended to do it thematically. So, you know, you take responsibility for this project or this campaign. You take it for this. You lead it. We're all very collaborative. It's not anyone going off on their own. You have to lose your ego, for sure. And it works brilliantly, because I honestly think in a job share, you get more than the sum of the parts that are, you know, creating that job share would have alone. And I think that we are getting more out of this role now than we ever have done. But that requires an organisation to be, you know, to support that way of working. It's a bit more work for an organisation to do that. So it's, you know, it's 2 HR files instead of one, and it's there's, you know, there is some complexities around it. But ultimately, for me, that organisation, the one I work for, EIS, retained 2 people that they wanted to keep. They wanted to keep the talent, 2 hugely experienced people that probably would have had to leave a full-time role, because it, you know, Esme, my job share, has actually literally just had her second baby recently. Yeah. So, you know, we both would not be able to do that full role, but we both can do part of it. So that's just an example for me of where, and I used to say, oh, I'm really grateful. And actually I'm not, like, me and Esme, we earn that. Like, we are doing a job because we are good at it. And actually, we do it really well as a job share, and I don't think everyone could do that. I don't think everyone could put ego aside and.
But that's good leadership, though, isn't it?
I think so.
Aside in that sense,
I think
rather
so.
than I'm the eagle leader and standing up tall, and I hold the position. So it sounds like there's I'm sure there's another set of different factors here, but there's some internal self barriers about whether I can do this, to step up into a given role, particularly given around the idea, particularly around being pregnant, having babies, managing your child, and so on. But also, there's an internal barriers within an employer in terms of the way it's always done, the traditions, the way we like to structure things, or the additional discretionary effort that people are going to have to put in, or to be flexible and open-minded to accommodate. So you've been campaigning on this front as well as the female athlete from a physical point of view and so on. Let's just wrap up a little bit with what would your top tips be if you were sharing a platform with other business leaders? What would your tips be about as an experience as a female leader to how they can better embrace females as leaders?
So first, I would say that I think there is still a bias that men make better leaders. I know that's probably not in this room, but there is certainly in some industries. So I think to acknowledge the real strengths that women can bring to leadership, and they might lead. It's all very individual. They might lead in a different way. It might come from empathy and connection, and we know that's hugely powerful in creating a space where people want to come to work. So I would say that women make great leaders. I would say that. And I'd say as an organisation to be very open-minded, and that's, really easy to say, and to be deliberate and explicit about it, because there will be people in your organisation, wherever you work, who will be thinking, they won't let me do that. Or I could never step up into that role because it's full-time and I only want to work 4 days a week, or whatever. There will be people thinking that because it's not on show and because you haven't spoken about it. And I also think it's really important not to pay lip service to it. So to say, oh, we have a very, supportive approach to flexible working, and then do not follow it through with your behaviours. And it's because it's very easy. It's very often now to say we support flexible working, and to not actually really get to grips with what that looks like. It's not about being present. If you can have someone working from home, and not be in the office because they haven't got meetings or they can't do those on conference calls, they do not need to be in the office. And there are still many industries. I have a friend who was telling me a story the other day about working in the city, and their boss expects them to be at their desk 9 to 5. That's an old way of working, right? And I think we need to get rid of that, not just for the working mums amongst us, but for everyone to have a balance of life and work. And if you can spend 2 hours less in the car, surely you're a more productive individual, whether you spend those 2 hours working or you spend them playing, which is really productive for your work space as well. So it's about not just playing lip service to it and not saying, oh, well, John down the corridor compresses his hours and has half a day off. That, being really creative and not being afraid to go out and look for examples. So when we were job sharing, we went to look for examples, and there's some great resources. We found some online, but there's also some, meeting real people who are doing it and asking them how they're making it work, so that you can bring that to life in your organisation, rather than saying, okay, well, just consolidate your hours from 5 days into 4 and then having someone burn out because they literally cannot cope. So I think I guess my plea would be that there is, again, much like the female athlete, there's so much opportunity here.
Yeah.
It is about being creative and not being afraid to make up some new rules, like throw away the old rule book and ask other people how they're doing it. And, it won't just be women who want to job share or be flexible. It will be everybody. And I think there are some good organisations out there doing it really well now as well.
So it's to embrace the strengths, that empathic approach, being deliberate about it and being proactive, seeing other examples, to sound very similar to the project around female health,
Yeah.
in the same way that you're ultimately being performance focused, that a different perspective, a whole population of people that can contribute to the conversation are potentially being ignored. There's knowledge and insight and ideas and different ways of working that, in the same way that talking about female athlete areas that would expose performance for you to work with.
Yeah, for sure.
Emma, it's been a delight to catch up. I'm so excited about how this is all progressing and so excited to see how this goes forward in the future. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for having me, Steve.